Okay, it's recording now.
Okay, cool. So I think the first thing we'll do is introductions. So if we just want to introduce ourselves one by one. So I'll start with myself. My name's Kimia. I'm the co-environmental and ethics officer. My pronouns are she, they, and also like as we're going around, like give us like positions in societies and why you think the climate crisis is important. So I'll pass to Asosa right now.
Hi, I'm Asosa. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the other half of the Environment and Ethics Officer team. I think I'll pass on to Hadil.
Hadil.
Yeah, I'm Hadil. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a final year English student. I'm president of Friends of Palestine, and I'm also involved with Anti-Racism Society and Anti-Sexism Society.
Thank you, Hadil.
Asma, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Asma. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a first year student at Warwick, and I'm partially involved with Apartheid Off Campus, which is like a grassroots Palestinian activist organization. And the reason I'm here is because we've been kind of investigating Warwick's investments and how they're complicit with the climate crisis.
Should we go to Rachel then?
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel. My pronouns are she, they. I'm co-ethnic minorities officer and also a part of WARSOC, so Anti-Racism Society.
Thank you. We'll go to Tommy.
Hi, I'm Tommy. I'm a second year PP student. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm on WARSOC and also Friends of Palestine. Exactly.
Go to Fraser.
Hiya, I'm Fraser. I'm on the Warwick Labour and National Young Labour Committees. I'm a final year GSD student, particularly interested in organising around climate justice. I'm writing my dissertation on the Green New Deal and climate justice organising.
Thank you. And we'll go to Zara now.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Zara Sultana. I'm the Labour Member of Parliament for Coventry South, and part of Warwick comes into that. So I'm really honoured to be with you guys virtually. I'm really passionate about this topic. It's one of the key themes of my maiden speech, and since then it's been one of the things that I've been focusing quite a bit on. And just like to say very quickly, with the pandemic, we have seen the importance of being able to respond to crises. And while we have a public health crisis right now, we know that the climate crisis is one that overshadows all of this. And especially in Coventry, my office have been working to see how we can transition some of the manufacturing jobs to green, clean, the jobs of the future. So this is a topic that's very close to our hearts. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you. Okay. I think we'll just get started then. So one thing that I did want to raise is obviously me and Associate give an introduction to why we even chose to do this event and the theme for our entire Green Week. So obviously as environmental ethics officers, we've had a lot of meetings with a lot of different societies and people concerned with sustainability on campus. And a number of times the same eco-fascist rhetoric would pop up with people focusing on overpopulation instead of focusing on the larger picture, i.e. Institutions and how they should be accountable for the climate crisis. And since our election, we've always wanted to focus on the climate crisis and the impact it's having on the global south, because I never really hear it mentioned enough, especially at Warwick. There seems to be more focus on I guess more individualistic sustainability campaigns instead of noticing the larger kind of scale of it. I guess we wanted to really stress the urgency of the climate crisis throughout this week. So if we go to Asosa.
So this week is almost a continuation of the work that Kimmy and I have been doing this entire year. Most notably, or most difficultly, has been trying to pass our divest motion through the SU. We found that this students' union and this university more generally love paying lip service to more radical or green ideas such as decolonizing or decolonizing the curriculum, which is a project that me and Kimmy were both part of. But when it comes to actually doing the decolonial work, there's very much crickets and silence. We found that sustainability and climate activism are buzzwords on this campus, where people talk a lot, but when it comes to doing the actual action, people are dragging their feet. So we really wanted to have this entire week basing it around the theme that the climate crisis is already here. It's not some far off impending doom. Figures like 2050 or 2030 don't make sense when we can see already the impact that the climate crisis is having disproportionately on the global south, disproportionately on people who didn't create this crisis. So we really wanted to use this week as a way to reframe the climate crisis as something that's already arrived, and also to unpack its structural elements, to recognize it as a racist crisis, as a sexist crisis, and as a crisis of capitalism. So yeah, I think we'll pass over to our speakers now just to give a quick overview, and then we'll go into some pre-prepared questions.
Okay, so yeah, I think we'll just ask it to the panel, but what does the climate crisis actually look like today? And feel free to just put your hands up if you want to speak. Yeah, Fraser.
So this isn't so much an answer to the first question, but I did kind of have a think about how I think it's useful to frame and think about the climate crisis based around the title. So I think that, obviously the title of this event correctly says that the climate crisis is already here, but more than that, I think we can kind of see the climate crisis has been here for at least 4 centuries. Recently, there's been an extensive debate over the periodization of the Anthropocene, a new geological era which is defined by novel climatic and ecological conditions, typically described as being caused by humanity in general. But humanity in general has been acting on and remaking natural environments for millions of years. What has really changed is the social organization, which determines the kind of relationship human work has to the rest of nature. That organization is characterized by production for profit at the expense of any and all social or ecological considerations. And its history is the history of colonial appropriation, racialization, and the differential exploitation of the vast majority of the world's peoples by the few. A study out of UCL in 2015 proposed a possible origin point for the Anthropocene of 1610. That year saw a rapid dip in CO2 levels, which they named the Orbis spike. They discovered that the colonization and settlement of the Americas, initiated in 1492, and the genocide of over 90% of indigenous American people, actually depopulated the American continents to such an extent that there was mass reforestation of cultivated and foraged lands, triggering a dramatic drop in CO2 levels. So this process of appropriation of ecologies formed and made by indigenous American peoples was at the same time also a process of exploitation of their labor, a process of racialization, and one ultimately of accumulation for Western European ruling classes. That was the historical crucible in which the relations which drive the climate crisis today were first crystallized. And if we see it in that historical scope, we can understand that for millions of people on the American continents, the climate crisis, climate apocalypse even, came centuries ago. Modern history is marked by climate crises. From the over 7 million Indian peasants that died in the 19th century as a result of the reorganization of agriculture by the British ruling class, to the workers that choked on the fumes of industrial pollution built on the back of that colonial exploitation. And throughout these processes, every time accumulation has run into a natural limit, it's been resolved by deepening and deferring the crisis. So that today, although we've had the Green Revolution, we've had massive investment in agricultural productivity, hundreds of millions of people go hungry each year as land grabs have displaced subsistence agriculture. was cash crop production for the world market, and the underlying fertility of the thin layer of soil on the Earth's crust on which all livable human society depends is being depleted. So I think that to start off, whenever we're told that investment in this or that technological change is going to avert a climate crisis that's coming, I think we should find that idea terrifying, to be honest, and we should remember the people for whom the climate crisis has already happened and is already happening. And we should remember that the climate crisis is a lot more than a chart of CO2 equivalent parts per million, and that to end the climate crisis, we have to transform the form of social organization that produced it in the first place and that reproduces it after every single supposed technological fix. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your talk. Does anyone have anything else to add? Oh, yeah, Zara.
I mean, I really can't top what Fraser's just said with the historical lens that we need to be looking at this crisis through. But I think when we think about it in terms of what's happening today, like the speakers before have already talked about, we've seen the crisis here in the UK and globally. Just, you know, some basic stats with the 10 warmest years on record in the UK have all come since 2002. Since 2009, we've had the wettest February, April, June, November, and December on record. We are seeing increased flooding and deaths in the UK caused by these weather patterns. In fact, in December 2020, there was the death of Ella Kissy Deborah in London, and that was the first death that was cited as being caused by pollution because Ella had severe asthma. And these are working class people in inner cities who are dying from the climate crisis here in the UK. And then when we look at things globally, again, fossil fuels have caused 8.7 million deaths. According to the Lancet research back in 2019 for 2018, that's pollution and everything else, as well as extreme weather patterns. And we've seen the wildfires in the US and Australia, and we've seen the flooding and droughts elsewhere in the world. And if we carry on with current trajectories, and like Fraser said, the way society is organized, parts of the world will simply become uninhabitable, and there will be islands that don't exist. People will be forced to flee their homes. Droughts will become more common. There will be wars over water shortages and food shortages, and this will obviously be disproportionately hitting the global south. And then when we look at it in kind of in terms of international law, we don't even have climate refugees as something that we should be, as in they're not recognizing in international law. So we are not even thinking about how we're going to accommodate for that situation, which is already taking place in parts of the world. And I think that's what's frightening, as Fraser said, that this has been happening for centuries, and actually the worst is yet to come, which is, yeah, very scary. And that's why we have to fight, and we have to organize, because the ruling class will continue to pillage and profit at the expense of everyone else. They're simply going to just, fly to Mars, probably, and colonize Mars at this rate.
Thank you, Zara. Does anyone else have something to add? Yeah, Tommy.
Yeah, just a small addition. But yeah, I think it's important to recognize as well, not necessarily in a fatalistic way that says oh, there's nothing we can do about it, but that the sort of relations and processes which have set the climate crisis in motion are historic and have already happened. And looking forward to the next sort of 20, 30 years, we also have to recognize that the effects that are going to be caused are not reversible at this point. So we're still feeling the effects of things which have happened 30, 40 years ago now, filtering through long sort of feedback processes that take a long time for things to shift through and actually feel the effects. So really, regardless of whether we get to carbon neutrality or whatever by 2050, etc., we're already going to be feeling the effects of our production currently. And it's not to say that we shouldn't obviously resist, do everything we can, but the reality is that we are not going to get rid of this mode of production in the very immediate future. And so I think it's important, when we talk about the climate crisis is already here, that we have to recognize that the future effects for example, like climate refugees, that is something which will happen. It's unavoidable basically at this point. So we need to be factoring that in to how we envision crisis, because that crisis has already begun. We're already seeing Pacific Islanders being turned away from countries like Australia and New Zealand, saying that they have no grounds to migrate there, even though their homes have been destroyed by sort of capitalist and imperialist caused climate change. So yeah, I think not to be fatalistic, but recognizing like the severity of the situation is important if we're to be able to actually do anything about it.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like it's not even fatalistic to suggest that, because we have to realize the severity of it to even begin to understand how we can address it. Rachel?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think the climate crisis today, well, as Tommy said, it is an extension of imperialism. It is an extension and a byproduct of colonialisms. So when I say that, like, I think about the Industrial Revolution, for example, whereby all the resources were garnered from British colonies, and the Industrial Revolution created so much pollution, and we can see the effects of that still going on today. So while like the climate crisis does disproportionately affect Black and brown people in the global South, it is because Black and brown people in the global South were and still are colonial subjects, which is why the climate crisis is so, I feel like when we approach it, it is very difficult, because it's like, okay, as much as like apparently this is an environmental issue, it's also like a capitalist issue, it's also a racist issue, it's all of these issues put together. So yeah.
Thank you. Hadil?
Yeah, so I'm kind of giving like the Palestine side of things. So if we want to understand what the climate crisis actually looks like in Palestine, then we have to contextualize it within the occupation. We can't just look at it with an apolitical lens. So we have to talk about like the unequal distribution of resources when it comes to land and water. For example, Israel, when it the way it industrializes the land, ruins the land in the way that they rely on GMOs and chemicals, and for Palestinians, the main connection to the land is through taking care of the land and basically like living with the land. So kind of to understand that the context of the occupation is like we have to focus on that if we want to understand what the climate crisis looks like. And because of the unequal distribution of resources, Palestinians rely on basically rain-fed agriculture, but then they'd have to rely on depicting weather patterns. But because of the climate crisis, you can't really predict it, which has kind of affected their ability to use their local forms of knowledge and their understanding of the land. So yeah, if we want to understand the climate crisis, then it has to address the political context of the occupation. Otherwise, the conversation is meaningless.
Thank you so much, Hadil. Asma?
Yeah, and just to give kind of like the organising or divestment perspective, I think when we ask that question of what does the climate crisis look like, what it looks like is that it looks like starkly different from one place to another. And so I think it's really useful to think of it as also like a crisis of perception, especially when we're approaching solutions or trying to like make any kind of meaningful change. We have to understand that it is a crisis of perception, and us in the global South will perceive the crisis differently. So it's a consequence, of course, of living in accordance with like certain toxic values of colonial, like patriarchal, racist, individualist, extractivist systems. And that is, as that it is, the lens that we view the issue from. And that's how we analyze it. And that is what mainstream environmentalists don't necessarily want to acknowledge, is that we have obviously like a very individualistic way of seeing the crisis, and that in order to transition to any kind of regenerative culture, we have to recognize that we're also functioning within these systems as we're trying to like act against them, and we have been socialized by them. So we will value what these systems have taught us to value, which is of course hard facts and figures and carbon neutrality goals, which obviously dismiss so many of the nuances and the urgencies that we need to take into account. And of course we cannot move forward without going through like a period of like collective introspection, where we collectively like challenge the assumptions and the values that we hold, and only then can we actually try to treat the underlying problem of climate change. So I'd say that what climate change actually looks like today is that it's simply just a symptom of like a much wider underlying problem.
Thank you so much, Asma. I think we'll move on to the next question then.
Okay, so the next question is, are we doing enough right now? So when we look at the mainstream approach to the climate crisis, as in shopping sustainably, thrifting, recycling, upcycling, reusing, are those individualistic actions enough to stop this cycle that we are in of climate crises? Tommy?
I mean, I guess to an extent it does depend on who you conceive we to be, because like in some senses people are doing enough, people resisting sort of colonialism, imperialism, dispossession, and sort of things like that. Black and Indigenous people have been doing that around the world for centuries, as Fraser said, if we're framing it historically. So realistically, people are doing what they can to resist it, but obviously in the sense of people here, like within Britain, yeah, obviously the answer is no. But again, that isn't necessarily a limitation of a result of like poor efforts on the behalf of like so-called environmentalists, etc. Is actually also the challenge that we're up against in dismantling these structures. To do enough would mean to completely overhaul capitalist modernity, basically, and that is a task which has never been. There's no task that's been undertaken like that before. So we can only do enough when we really set into motion the real overhaul of that system, really.
Thanks. Camilla?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on, I feel like especially at Warwick, students are doing so much. We've seen BDS motions being like trying to be passed, and people leading misinformation campaigns to try and make it seem like it's not, or say, or when the main aim of BDS is to obviously like divest from companies complicit in apartheid and also complicit in the climate crisis as well, because obviously those two are interconnected. Again, we just see so much that we're up against, even on the grassroots scale. And again, with our divest motion, having lawyers from, like Lawyers for Israel, like sending in legal challenges to a divest motion. Again, we can see like Black and brown activists in universities, especially in apartheid of campus, doing so much, but then it's also realizing what we're up against. Zara?
Thank you. Like Tommy said, I think individually people are trying their best, but the scale of the challenge we face is huge. In 2017, for example, the IPCC said that to prevent climate catastrophe, that would require rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. That has not happened. When we think about the choices that people might make, they might, not have plastic straws, or they might have bags for life, and those are really good lifestyle decisions, and they're good, but they're not nearly enough. We know that the crisis is a capitalist crisis, and those individual consumption choices aren't enough. We know when it comes to climate change targets, for example, 2050 is a death sentence for so many people as it is. But even then, even with a target that is not good enough, the government's still set to miss that by 49 years. And then when we look at who is responsible for the crisis, and there's information that 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions, then we know that we're not doing nearly enough, because they're just going to carry on, or they might have a social media campaign about carbon footprints and whatnot. But in terms of the trends and how much we really need to reorganize society, that definitely hasn't happened.
Thank you, Zara. Hideo?
I think the point Tommy made about who is we is very important, because if we want to talk about ourselves, then we can do more in terms of educating people. Like, for sure, we're doing a lot, but we need to like really work on sending out the message that the climate crisis can't be solved through relying on the system, and it won't go away by simply voting blue no matter who. So we need to do so much more when it comes to political education within the university and beyond as well. And if we look at like Palestinians in Palestine themselves, there are a lot of efforts to care for the land and to maintain that relationship and connection with it that defined the relationship with the land before 1948. So I don't know if you know about stewardship, but it's basically how the older Palestinians are trying to pass down the knowledge to younger Palestinians about indigenous ways of caring for the land. And this is a practice common amongst indigenous communities in the US and Canada as well, where there is an insistence on maintaining traditional ways of caring for the land. And people in Gaza have worked on recycling materials to produce bricks to build houses, and they've made electric cars and things like that. And part of the reason they're doing all of this is because of the siege and nothing can go in and out, but also there's this culture of reusing and recycling the materials that are already available. So I'd say there are a lot of efforts being made over here and everywhere, but there's of course like a lot more that can be done.
Thank you, Hadil. Rachel?
Yeah, on the question on who is we, like, I think that is a very good point to start from. I think for a lot of Black and Brown, especially working class and poor people, they've been compelled to be sustainable. So when we look at, for example, the idea of like reusing oil, if you fry something and you're going to fry something later on, reusing the oil, or hand-me-down, so someone having a cousin who just gives them clothes, like those kind of traditions, they are, as much as they are sustainable, yes, they are also, like, the working class are compelled to do so. But then when I think about like thrifting, for example, and how that is a form of sustainability, but then I also think about how that has been like privatized, basically, with richer people going into thrift stores and then they're bumping up the prices, making that mode of sustainability inaccessible. So I think as much as there are, like, as much as we can do things, a lot of the time it's out of our control, and oftentimes like it is the rich people, who have control, who can, you know, do what they do.
Thanks, Rachel. Is there any more contributions on that question, or Asma?
Yeah, just to answer the question of like whether we're doing enough, even from like a student perspective, and even though like we're working on a divestment campaign, BDS, especially with the divestment campaign, I think there's this notion that like, oh, if the university divests, then we've done our part in solving the climate solution, or like this is the only and main way that the university is complicit in climate destruction. That's obviously completely a myth. Like, we have to understand that like this university, and like if we're going to locate ourselves in the climate issue, we have to understand that our complicity of the climate crisis goes way beyond the investments at this university. We have to understand that it's literally built on racist, white supremacist foundations. It's built on colonial science and exclusive forms of knowledge that have literally gone hand in hand with pillaging the earth and resulting in this climate crisis that we speak of. So our university has provided and continued to provide the science that is needed to exploit nature and humans in this way. So we're definitely not saying that if the university divests, then all the problems are solved. We're just saying that by tracing the financial history of this place, you can clearly kind of expose where its priorities lie. And it could act as like a uniting front for like all the different struggles on campus, to kind of understand that this university is actively working against us. But yeah, we're way more complicit than just financially.
Thanks, Asma. Fraser.
Yeah, so I think, as everybody said, like some people are definitely doing a lot, maybe even too much, or like it's clear, like Kimmy and Associate, like you've done so much work, and you've been put through so much shit by this appalling institution. And I feel like probably the more that we can like do this work through like collective organization, going from like mobilization to organization, the more it can be made more sustainable, so that it's not just on a small number of people, and you don't kind of get the burnout and the unsustainability of that work. And then I think like organization also enables you to kind of institutionalized things much more. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Fraser. Do we have any more contributions on that question, or shall we move on? Okay. The next question was, even if we meet the current international goals of carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2030, what does this mean? What does this look like? Who is being sacrificed in order for us to meet these goals? We've kind of touched on this point a little bit. Tommy and Fraser have touched on this point a little bit, but I just want us to push more into it. If we're saying that the climate crisis is already here and we're setting goals of 2050 and 2030, who exactly are we sacrificing, and why is that sacrifice not being worked into the discourse of understanding where we will be in 2050 or 2030? Rachel?
I think just to comment on the language of like being sacrificed, a lot of people who have died and who unfortunately will die because of the climate crisis have not now come and put themselves forward to be the sacrificial lamb. Like that's not what they desire to do. So I think the idea of like sacrificing is a way for capitalists and a way for like imperialists and colonialists to kind of make the situation better, for them to absolve responsibility and just say, oh yeah, like these people died for X, Y, and Z, when that really isn't the case. And I think, as we know, a lot of Black and brown people in the global South will be affected, already are being affected, and will continue to be disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. So I think that answers the question.
Thanks, Rachel. Kimia?
Yeah, well, also one thing I wanted to add, I think carbon neutrality as well just seems, I don't know how to word it, but like more of an accessible thing for like the global north to do, when a lot of countries in the global south don't have the facilities to even get to like this carbon neutrality goal because of colonialism and because of imperialism. They don't have the facilities. Like I did some research about air pollution in Iran, and they can't even afford catalytic converters or even access these facilities because of American sanctions. So then it's like, how do we trace stuff like imperialism when understanding how we can get the entire globe to get to that carbon neutrality goal, supposedly? Yeah.
Thanks, Kimia. Asma?
Yeah, just to add on to Kimia's point, like definitely another part of the problem is like the standard or the scale with which we measure progress. If carbon neutrality progress relates to how carbon neutral a country is, without like taking into account that most of the time, if a country is lowering its carbon emissions, it's because it's literally exporting it to other countries in its production process. So, for example, with electric cars here in the UK, the batteries and like mining and the carbon emissions, they're all just happening in the global south. So it's nice and hidden away, and we can say that we've made progress, but actually, is it progress? It's literally just neocolonialism. But also with this question of like, if we reach those goals by 2050, I think Warwick has even said that like is going to be a carbon neutral campus by 2050. This is part of the problem, is that we're focusing on these stats and the science in our narratives and our solutions, and we're completely excluding any other forms of knowledge in this crisis, which is largely like a crisis of human experience, and we're trying to find technological solutions for a problem that is largely about social organization, as Fraser said. So when you focus on these figures and the science, you often look past much of the nuances, and you look past the histories of struggle, this histories of dignity and resilience, and you look past the real solutions that Hadil mentioned in Palestine, and you look past the vast intergenerational knowledge of living in harmony and in unity with nature that many cultures already have. And Indigenous communities always remind us that we're not separate from nature, and that protecting the environment is also protecting ourselves. So in order to survive, communities in the global south continue to actually lead the building of new systems of social organization that are actually free of the violence of capitalism. So we have to center their experiences in the solutions, I think. We have to recognize that those types of knowledge that aren't necessarily focused on like hard facts and deadlines and pie charts are actually have inherent value as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, that it's the same logic, science, modes of thinking that landed us in or create and perpetuate this crisis that we're now relying on to get us out of this crisis, or to avert or to do damage control on this crisis. And not only does this decenter the global south, but it puts the global south in harm's way. It kind of exports all of the consequences and all of the negative side effects of the way that we live our lives, the way that we've ordered our society and our economy to the global south. So very much like what Rachel was saying, it's an extension of colonialism, it's an extension of imperialism. The climate crisis is very much a neo-colonialist crisis, yeah. Does anybody have anything else to add on this question? Tommy?
Yeah, the other thing I would say is like, obviously the question is assuming that we meet the targets of carbon neutrality, but ultimately that's not going to happen anyway. So yeah, we're in a worse situation than I think the question actually even frames. Yeah, like carbon neutrality by 2050, I think is meant to keep us, I don't know if people are still saying that would keep us below 1.5 degrees, but I know we're on track for like 3.5 to 4 at the moment. And obviously when there's that much, like that level of warming, there's also going to be like positive feedback, which makes it even worse. So yeah, like all the sacrifice of like racialized people, all the racialized and gendered dynamics, class dynamics, etc., they're all going to be even worse than potentially people who are being optimistic are actually framing.
Fraser?
Yeah, I feel like targets and language of targets is really kind of typical of neoliberal governance, where it's kind of like we have targets for things that aren't going to happen. Like we have a child poverty target, which makes us feel like, all right, something's being done. There's like a target we're going to hit, and it's never hit, and it never happens. We have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we're going to invest in sustainable development. You have whole courses at universities designed around the UN Sustainable Development Goals that will never actually be realized. And I feel like that's the kind of political function that these targets perform for political elites. And yeah, they are never going to be met.
Asma?
Yeah, I just wanted to add onto what Fraser said. That is actually probably the most sinister part of the whole problem, is that it really makes you think that something is being done, or actually it's all just greenwashing, but everyone is led to believe that we are working towards something, and that is its function. Its function is distraction from like real action.
Thank you. Hadiya?
Yeah, just on the topic of deadlines, like even Gaza, they said that it would be uninhabitable by 2020, and now we're in 2021. So the idea is that as long as the people affected are invisible, then it's okay. So if the global north is just going to export the problems to the global south, then it doesn't matter if these goals aren't met by 2050, because the people are invisible anyways.
Yeah, Zara?
Just very quickly touch on what Asma and Fraser said about targets, and we're going to see that the big show of the performance of targets and neoliberalism at COP26, where all attention will be on Glasgow and what political elites from across the world come up with. And the irony of it all is that this government, that this Conservative government, has said it's the greenest government ever, and it will talk about all sorts of crap, really, and then still have plans to open a coal mine in Cumbria, still go to a trade summit in Africa, and have billions in fossil fuel deals. And it's that language which kind of serves as a distraction. But I just thought I'd kind of go on the comments that were made earlier about that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important, the contributions that were made just now about how this crisis has branded itself, and how governments, how neoliberalism, how the West has branded itself as coming to save the day and setting certain targets, when in reality it's all just absolute nonsense. Yeah. Do we have any more contributions on
And
this?
they're also responsible for it.
Do we have any more contributions on this question, or Tommy?
Yeah, just briefly, like what Fraser said about like the climate crisis being framed and understood in like this sort of liberal governmental way, I think is actually, I think it is so important in understanding like the difference between how we want to approach it compared to how states want to approach it, because it really speaks to how they conceive it as some sort of, okay, it's a big kind of problem, but realistically it's just something that we can faff around with within the existing system, make some technological changes, do some things with the state and the market, maybe some subsidies, and it will all go away. Whereas we understand the climate crisis being something which is it's a crisis of humanity, basically, on all levels, and all our social relations, and our relationship with nature as well. So I think unpacking how, like, yeah, the language of targets, and the narrow framing of climate change, I think is very important in terms of like posing an alternative view of how we conceive it and how we can understand its effects and combat them.
Yeah, thank you. Any more contributions?
Okay, I think we'll move on to the next question then. So yeah, the next question: how is the climate crisis being whitewashed, and how can we see this in the type of like individualism versus like systemic change? Yeah. I feel like whitewash and greenwash are almost like synonymous, so we can also talk about that.
I mean, yeah, I can talk shit about XR. Yeah, like as we can see, even the so-called radical, or at least visible, aspects of like global north environmentalism are just unbelievably terrible in every way. Basically, they're bad because politically they don't understand what needs to be done economically either, and fundamentally their conception of the climate crisis again is framed in such a limited way that means that I guess it feeds into what we're talking about with in terms of like, oh, make the campus like green by 2050. It's like it's such a narrow understanding of like the effects of climate change, and like even the language which people like in exile use, like our children are going to die because of this. Like, okay, but there's also so many other things which are happening in the climate crisis which will precede people in the global north feeling the physical effects of climate change. Yeah, there's just a complete, I think the main problem is a lack of internationalism and a lack of solidarity within the climate movement. So there's a completely like nation state centric, global north centric analysis of the effects of climate change, and no understanding of the structure behind it, which obviously leads to climate activism looking white and ultimately doing nothing to challenge the climate crisis and or anything underpinning it, which is ultimately what's most important. Yeah.
There's a balloon in our thing and it just popped. Sorry about that. Yeah, no, 100%. And I was going to also add, we see XR activists kind of go like in their demonstrations, kind of talking to the police or like organising with them. I don't really understand that. And it's kind of the thing that the way I imagine climate crisis activism would be completely different to what an XR activist imagines it if they're organising with police officers or are complicit or even actively involving an institution that upholds colonialism and colonial legacies. So yeah, Rachel?
Yeah, I think the idea of like the climate crisis being whitewashed, it does tie into a lot of discussions about like diet and veganism and stuff like that. And I think first and foremost, like on veganism, I think the idea of like it being whitewashed completely erases like the Black and brown communities that have been not eating meat, that have been on their ITAL diet, their ITAL like diets and stuff like that. So that's one aspect of it. And also, I think the pressure or the guilt tripping of what are they called, like activists, into compelling people of color who do eat meat. I feel like it just completely erases the colonial context. So say, for example, a lot of enslaved Africans, they were forced to eat, like the only diet that they got was like pork or bread, or like, okay, not bread, yeah, bread, but in terms of like the climate context, was like mostly meats. And it's like, okay, this whole culture has been formed around this in a way to survive this like horrible experience, and for you to just say, okay, like no, strip that away, completely erases the colonial context in which that is their culture. So while it has been whitewashed, I do think it, like, the whitewashing is just like they're not adding two and two together, like as to why they feel the need to tell people, oh, okay, do X, Y, and Z, because they were forced to like decades before. I don't hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Thank you, Rachel. Asma?
Yeah, just adding to that, I think the problem with a lot of like mainstream environmentalists, Western environmentalists, XR, is that like they can't imagine any other way of living or existing that could potentially be in harmony with nature, which is why they feel the need to go to this like extreme angle of like like the eco-fascist ideas of like humans are fundamentally at conflict with nature and are fundamentally at conflict with the environment, which is why like we can't eat meat, we have to like reduce our population, all these eco-fascist theories and stuff. It's because there is no like international solidarity, which is what Tommy was talking about, and there's no like looking back at our histories and looking back at alternatives and other ways of living and organizing and coexisting in harmony with nature. Yeah, I don't know where I was going with this, but...
No, thank you so much. Yeah, that was beautiful. Hadil?
Yeah, Rachel's point about veganism reminded me of that propaganda campaign that the IDF did about how IDF soldiers' boots are leather, but like they're vegan. But yeah, Israel has always used greenwashing as a way to hide its crimes. For example, it boasts about all these forests that it's planting, but this is actually a way to hide the villages that it's ethnically cleansed. So these forests are built on depopulated villages, and they also plant trees that are not native to the land, which dries out the soil, and they cut down Palestinians' trees. But you know, the boots are vegan, so whatever.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hadil. Any other points? Oh, Zara.
Just very quickly, I'm taken back to this debate around the climate emergency that I was in, and Notori MP, you can already imagine where this is going, basically remarked that it's the lack of family planning in Africa that was one of the key reasons for the climate crisis. And it just kind of baffled me that at that moment, I didn't see anyone else really just go like, what the fuck are you talking about? There was, and I feel like in spaces, especially in Parliament and those kind of privileged elite institutions, there are things that will be said, and like no one will really understand what's being. I mean, they understand what's being said. No one will challenge what's being said, and it just really kind of threw me that the problem isn't people in the global south, on the African continent and elsewhere having kids. It's disaster capitalism. But obviously, when you have people who are the ambassadors for disaster capitalism, they're not going to really talk about that, are they? But yeah, that's just what it took me back to.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Okay, does anyone have anything else to say? Okay, I think we'll move on to our last question. Yeah.
Okay, so the last question is, if we understand that the climate crisis has already arrived and has indeed been around, how does this change both our organising and the urgency in our organising, and what should our activism look like? So it's kind of a question towards the mainstream way that we organize around the climate crisis in terms of recycle more, use paper straws, all that kind of stuff. How does this understanding of the climate crisis, all the things that we've talked about as a racist crisis, a neo-colonial capitalist crisis, how does that change the urgency in our collective organizing? Camille?
I feel like, yeah, the question is also, do we work within the structure or do we work without it? Obviously, they're not really complete binaries, I guess, but I think it is also worth asking that because, again, just reflecting on our experiences as like SU officers, we've tried to work within a structure in order to achieve, I guess, some level of change. Even then, this is just to pass a motion. It's not even to get the university to divest from these companies itself. That's a whole like other battle. So then, even in like passing this motion, we've seen the labor that both of us have had to do to even get every word of that motion passed, to get Palestinian rights recognized in this student union that has for forever just marginalized Palestinian Black and brown students. So I guess now I've become increasingly even more disillusioned with structures that where you have to work essentially with your oppressors. You have to convince your oppressors, we want to pass this motion because it's good for the people you don't care about. So I guess, do we end up focusing on more radical organizing and external organizing instead of working alongside these structures is a question I also want to pose.
Rachel?
I think as we acknowledge that the climate crisis has been and continues to be fueled by capitalism and capitalists, then I think working within that system, it doesn't add up. Like, it doesn't add up. And then even what you were saying about straws, I remember when McDonald's first came out and they were like, okay, we have paper straws now, put the plastic away. The paper straws weren't even recyclable. So it's like all of these efforts by capitalists to perform sustainability, we can just see straight through it. So I do think, working with capitalists, working with organizations will never be it. But I do think also simultaneously, I do think there needs to be conscious, like, anti-capitalist organizing at the same time. So as much as we can just say, okay, like, we're not talking to the companies, we do also need to be in spaces that kind of inform us and encourage us to act against capitalists.
Thank you, Rachel. Anyone else? Tommy?
I think an important point to make in terms of recognizing the urgency and sort of already arrival of the climate crisis is about reparations, because I think realistically that is one of the key demands that we should be making right now if we are to actually mitigate the coming effects of climate change. And I think it also allows us to sort of, at least to some extent, obviously it doesn't deal with everything, but it allows us to crystallize a lot of the past sort of like colonial racist relations, and sort of bring about an idea of justice. So I think making those demands of the state I think that's the best thing we can get essentially from the state within this system for now, is demand like reparations and obviously like a Green New Deal or whatever, provided that it's not based on like colonial extraction and stuff. But yeah, like I think what Rachel said about anti-capitalist organizing is important as well, because ultimately there's a real limit to how much we can utilize within this system to build a world where production is not for profit, where our relations are not mediated by commodities within a society that has progressed to such extent that most things which exist are literally like a result of other things which exist for profit already existing. And then there's so little to be taken, I think, from this current organization. So I think building like positive strategies and ideas about what the future might be, and then attempting to resist capitalism and realize them, I think it is important. And I think the most important thing in that is supporting international struggles where those are taking place, where people are less empowered and are more pressingly fighting against the impacts of climate change.
Thank you. Hideo?
Yeah, so when talking about the urgency, there's a phrase that Palestinian activists use, which is "in our lifetime," because obviously it's been 73 years. So I think we need to approach the climate crisis in the same way, and to understand that we can't just think about, oh, it's going to affect my kids. We have to understand that the change needs to happen within our lifetimes. And there's a lot of change in, like, when it comes to organizing, but personally for me, I think the main thing we have to change, especially like in the UK and in the West, is how we approach the idea of borders. And Tommy touched on that a while earlier, because to understand climate change and the exploitation of resources, we need to understand how colonies themselves function as a way to help the exploitation of the resources of others, especially when there's an asymmetry of power between governments. Like, for example, Israel uses its hegemony in the region not only over Palestinians, but also over Jordan and Syria, and basically bullying them into water agreements that disadvantage them and cause agricultural crises in those countries. So even when we talk about Palestine, we also have to remember that the borders of what Palestine is supposed to be are also colonial borders. And we also have to remember that, for example, Israel is also occupying the Golan Heights, and there's a water crisis there as well. So so I think we just need to change the way we approach borders, because people kind of start to think that that's not my problem, it's another person's problem, and it kind of stands in the way of global solidarity as well.
Thanks, Hideo. Fraser, and then Rachel.
So I guess thinking about organizing for climate justice, there's maybe kind of three ways that I've been thinking about it. Is you're trying to actually literally disrupt the actual material processes by which the climate process is carrying on. I think Andreas Malm has written a book recently about how to blow up a pipeline, which is actually talking about exploring the possibility of taking of kind of escalating climate action, and that can also be done especially through unionizing workers in crucial sectors for the fossil fuel industry, and disruption like in that way. I think another thing that Tommy's spoken about is making demands of the state, and demanding and trying to push for like reforms and to like do damage limitation. And another thing I think is important is building organization and structures that demonstrate that a different way of producing and living is possible to some extent. So I think, for example, one thing that's really interesting is the idea of like, it's called like a national food service, but the idea is like establishing community kitchens, kind of sort of on the model of the Black Panther Party, that will provide like mass food and people would join. Like, so there's like one in Sheffield, there's one in Bristol, and kind of like the food is more ethically sourced, like there's a lot less waste because people are eating collectively. It kind of engenders kind of organization and builds relationships, and it provides working class people with the means of accessing food outside of the market, and then building that, like, so for example, building organizations that can contest social reproduction within the circuit capital, building like strong trade unions that actually understand that part of the process by which workers are exploited is the appropriation of ecology, and that fight to transform and take control of how production is happening, like the Lucas aerospace workers as a past example. And then in that process, being willing to strategically enter and use institutions of power where it's useful. Obviously, with Warwick SU, there's a question as to whether it's worth the effort. But I feel like, for example, Zara is able to go and use the platform of Parliament and speak to millions of people about kind of radical politics, and is able to kind of turn those tools against the state to some extent. And you kind of have to make a strategic assessment, I think, about when it's useful to do that, when it's not useful to do that. But it's also important to remember, I think, that the structures of power and the logic that shapes these institutions are not limited to these institutions. They exist outside the institutions. So just because we're not in the state, or we're not organising in the SU, we haven't escaped it, which is the difficulty. I don't think that's an outsider power, which is why I think you kind of need a strategic approach.
Thanks, Fraser. Zara has left, but I just want to say thank you, Zara, for all your wonderful contributions and for being on the panel.
I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Fraser. Rachel?
On Tommy's point on reparations, I think we can see the harm that the lack of reparations has on countries. So Haiti, for example, with their earthquake, they weren't able to, one, prepare, and two, respond as they would have liked, because they were in debt to France for so many years, with billions. I think it was £12 billion, if I'm correct. So we can see reparations and kind of the legacy of colonialism, of owing the imperial power money, still has an effect on countries today, and means that they can't respond or prepare or just adjust to the climate crisis in a way that they would like.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I just wanted to add as well, the conversation on reparations is so important, but I think I just want to bring in the point that Kimia made also about sanctions, and the role that sanctions play as well, not just in the Middle East, not just in Iran, but also in South America. As we're having conversations about reparations, I think it's important to also consider sanctions and have conversations about the impact that sanctions have. But yeah, Tommy, you had your hand up and then it went down. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, it was on what Hadil said earlier about borders and sort of interconnectedness. I think that's a very important thing to think about when we're sort of thinking about the climate crisis, because we have to understand that if we understand capitalism as driving it, capitalism is a world system that operates on a global scale, and I think there can be danger in sometimes the rhetoric about these corporations are driving climate change, because it's not the corporations themselves which are driving climate change, it's the existence of capital and the fact that it has to accumulate because it's the dominant mode of production. So I think adding that lens that it's not just, you can't bound the effects of the climate crisis within nation states, and more importantly, the solutions to the climate crisis within nation states, I think is important to recognize. And then the second thing I was going to say was, just in terms of positive visions for the future and sort of building ways outside of the market relation, etc. I think taking examples, it's been mentioned before, but taking examples from Indigenous people around the world and their relationships to land, I think stewardship is the most important thing, like Adil said. And also, I think maybe even within the university context, to thinking about how knowledge is produced, how we can still come up with conceive of the climate crisis only having these techno-scientific solutions, when realistically, I think we need to sort of democratize knowledge a bit more, because it's very clear that actually a lot of indigenous ways of living are actually better than the ones which Euromodern science has been able to come up with. So I think one great example is the Zapatistas in Mexico, and their relationship with the land and nature and society that they've developed in resistance to the Mexican state and capitalism. Obviously, it's a very small scale thing, and you can raise certain questions about things, but I think looking for inspirations that exist within the current system, even though you can't say that they exist outside of it, I think it has a positive benefit of giving us the imagination that we need to actually conceive of a different kind of world.
Thank you, Tommy. Kimia?
Yeah, 100% agree with that. And I was also going to say that I feel in a lot of meetings that we've had with specifically white environmentalists, they treat colonialism as if it was this past thing, and that we are in this post-colonial world where these systems of oppression don't necessarily affect people today. And obviously neocolonialism is also very much a thing obviously, like this Saturday, we'll be talking about BP. I had to do a cheeky plug, but BP and the neo-colonialism of a lot of fossil fuel industries across Africa and Asia is also one thing to be like concerned of, and also stuff like BAE systems and the connections they have with institutions in this country, like universities, and alongside like the thought of like imagination. If universities are not only complicit but are directly funding BAE systems, if we're trying to imagine futures without settler colonialism, without colonial structures, then do universities, do these types of institutions even exist in these imaginations? And I feel like these are questions we should also be asking. How do we really intertwine anti-racist organising, anti-colonial organising with our organising on the climate crisis? Yeah.
Thanks, Kimia. Asma?
Yeah, so obviously climate change doesn't recognize borders the way that Dio and Tommy have discussed before. So like if we say that borders cannot be taken into, we can't organize within borders when we're talking about climate change because the consequences are going to be felt across them, then we have to like obviously focus on building international solidarity. And I think from like an organizing perspective, that means we really need to stop organizing in like an isolated bubble. And I think a group, like a really good like example of that is Wretched of the Earth, which I'm sure a lot of people here are probably familiar with. And they're like a coalition of climate justice groups led by Indigenous people and people of color. And I think what is really good about them is they recognize that when we understand urgency, that has to immediately translate into forgetting ways that we've tried before that have failed us in organizing. So for example, like petitions and bureaucracy, COP conferences, and all these traditional organizing structures, they don't create any meaningful change. But equally, then what a lot of people will fall into the trap of doing is like organizing from like a route of like eco-anxiety or fear of collapse or despair, which I don't think is useful. And I think what we really need to hold on to is like radical hope and solidarity. And that's why these organizations are so good, because they actually allow us to like imagine resilient, sustainable communities and working together as an international community against all these common structures that exploit us. And I think just linking it back to the divestments, obviously, like we know that this university, from the list of investments that we've uncovered, they are invested in companies like BP, Shell, Chevron, even though they have a socially responsible investment policy, which says that they wouldn't invest in these kind of companies. But they're also invested in arms companies, they're invested in border security, they're invested in sweatshops. So what this is useful for is like uniting all our struggles and recognizing that they're all upheld by the same system. So if we're organizing against any of these structures of oppression, then we're also organizing against all the others. We're organizing for climate justice, and we're organizing against sexism, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism in general.
Thanks, Asma. Rachel, and then we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience.
On the topic of like the value of knowledge and how we understand knowledge, I do think because colonialism, as much as it was physical violence, there was also emotional violence, it was also spiritual violence because of indigenous communities' relationship with the land. So I think when we approach the climate crisis, we also need to approach it from a lens that even if there are physical kind of like reparations, there also needs to be that environment to foster spiritual and emotional connections. And yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that before we go to questions from the audience as well. I think it's so important to stress like the indigenous structures of organizing and of society and of living. But I think it's also important to note that a lot of that knowledge has been erased. A lot of those communities, there's been irreparable damage. And also sometimes then when capitalism comes in. So for example, my mum is always telling me about how her grandma used to wrap food in like banana leaves and palm leaves and stuff like that, and use bamboo and renewable stuff like that. And now we have like hippie white men in Silicon Valley, like making millions off of, you know, privatizing and capitalizing on these indigenous forms of knowledge. And a lot of the knowledge that my grandma had living sustainably, and my mum's like village in Nigeria had living sustainably, has been like erased, and there's no way to get that knowledge back. And I'm bringing attention to it because it's not just that it was erased and it stopped, like it's a continuous process of erasure, like that erasure continues onto this day, especially looking at how we treat indigenous, or how they treat indigenous communities in, you know, South America, moving in on people's land and, you know, just wiping people out, and all of that knowledge and all of those traditions and customs and vibrancy just being completely eradicated. So yeah, I'm going to open it up to the audience now for any questions.
You can put your hands up. Yeah. Naomi?
Yeah, hi. My question is, I mean, first, like, thank you so much. This is amazing, honestly. My question is kind of like, how do you guys see the idea of like echo chambers? Like, do you think echo chambers exist within kind of the environmentalist like movement? Do you think it's worth kind of, do you think we can get trapped in like an echo chamber? Do you think it's worth trying to approach people who don't necessarily see the climate crisis in the same way? Or do you think it's a dilution of energy to spend time like trying to convince people to perceive things differently?
Kimia, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Naomi. I think it's also like people are plugging in reading this and like plugging in theory. Obviously, it can be quite a lot of energy, and also a lot to expect Black and brown people to constantly have to talk to white environmentalists and be like, oh, consider us in your activism. And a lot of like reading this have been provided. I guess it's also takes like the labor of that white person to want to actually understand colonialism and capitalism in relation to the climate crisis, for example, or a lot of Black and brown theorists have even provided the theory for us to be imagining. None of my ideas are original. I'm really just like, I've really just read other people's ideas. So it's about, yeah, imagining alongside what amazing Black and brown theorists have been saying for centuries. So yeah.
I think as well, I think as well, like my personal experience of like leaving per se, like the echo chamber and like entering the SU and trying to like handhold people through these like realizations and through these theories has been incredibly violent, to say the least. So I think that there is comfort in organizing with your group. I do recognize that there is an importance on reaching people outside your circle. But again, pointing back to what Kimia said, like the labor should not be on Black and brown people to do that. It should be on like white environmentalists. It should be on them to do that themselves, because the resources are there. Like, you know, they are there and they are accessible. I'm not sure if you put up their hand first. So Fraser and then Rachel.
Yeah, so I guess I think that we don't to win, we don't need everybody to have like a very, very sophisticated understanding of like the theoretical nuances of the crisis. Like that's not how you kind of win power. I think that you kind of need to organize people. Like what results in a like fundamental change is organizing people around their interests. Do you know what I mean? People that partake in mass social movements, people that partake in trade union action, anti-colonial movements. Not every single person involved in that movement necessarily has like a very sophisticated theoretical understanding of what's going on, but they're in a material solidarity, and they've come to understand their interests as, in some sense, in antagonism with this process of kind of ecological destruction. And that's what we kind of like really need. And there's like, yeah, so there's like a hard limit to ideas that we definitely don't need to convince everybody of the ideas, because as well you'll get people that are like CEOs and will give you like some very lovely eloquent explanation of the history of the climate crisis and colonialism, but like if they're CEO of a company, what does it matter?
Yeah, thanks, Fraser. Rachel, and then Tommy.
Yeah, I also think like while an echo chamber can be very like limited, I think in echo chambers, like I feel like echo chambers are very, very important in organizing because it's within that society, it's within that community that you can now come up with new ideas and just feel comfortable there. And I do think for a lot of people of color, specifically Black women, for you to go outside of that echo chamber and interact with people who genuinely like don't value your humanity is very, like, is a very violent experience. So I do understand the need for, I do understand like why people would leave the echo chamber and like go to other institutions like the STU, because I'm also like an ethnic minorities officer. So I also, at the same time, I'm just like, listen, this life is already hard, period. Like this life is so hard. Why must I now come and make it harder? Like, no. So yeah.
Thanks, Rachel. Tommy.
Yeah, I think what Fraser said was important about organising people around their interests. And if we recognise that the climate crisis is composed of a number of overlapping and sort of intersecting structures of oppression, I think if we just do all we can to organise around those, then we're going to already be mitigating the effects of the climate crisis and changing it from how it plays out in the certain like colonial, racialized, gendered ways that it does currently. But yeah, and I think it is also important to recognize that, yeah, like being an echo chamber isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's a bad thing when it actually like leads to your interests and your what you want to not being materialized. So I think it is important to an extent to develop spaces where you can have like complex sort of theoretical discussions about X, Y, Z, or activist spaces, as long as that knowledge is not being like hoarded, and as long as you're not conceiving those echo chambers as sort of a space where you can, through your actions, enact top-down change on other people. Like the struggle is always going to be grassroots. So I think in that sense, environmentalists, or these radical environmentalists, do need to do more to try and promote political education and tie up people's interests to the climate crisis how they can. But ultimately, I think there's no way that people in environmental spaces anyway are going to somehow become some like vanguard party where they can lead the masses to like ecological liberation, stuff like that's not happening. So to an extent, I don't think it matters that much, but I think we do still need to improve.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Does anyone else have any questions from the audience, I guess? Oh, Ben?
Hey, yeah, I guess one thing I was thinking of was that with the kind of the sources of resource extraction and production being externalized internationally, what does activism, radical transformative activism, look like in the UK in this context? Is it just continuing doing some things but with a slightly different edge, or is it a completely different way of living and experiencing the world?
Thank you, Ben. Does anyone want to respond to that? Tommy?
In terms of like, I may have misheard, but like alternative modes of living, if I heard that like a different way, I think like the main limitation is that we can't actually do that right now. Like we do exist within capitalism, and specifically like the imperial core. So our ability to actually construct things right now is quite weak, but I think we should be having a more confrontational approach with capitalism and the state, but I won't say more because they're watching.
Yeah, Fraser.
I guess like I was trying to speak to this a bit earlier about kind of contesting social reproduction in the sense of like through things like a national food service, through like collective care institutions and other like membership institutions, try to try to create spaces in which you don't transcend or abolish or leave capitalism, but a kind of alter to capitalism and start to like that like have a slightly different logic to them, and then also give people like the material means to be able to feed themselves and to meet their most basic needs without having to rely on the market. And to do that collectively is really important, and not to kind of fall into this trap of like, if I just go vegan or if I just don't have leather or whatever, which is ultimately useless, obviously.
Thank you, Fraser. Hidil, Asma, and then I think we'll conclude the event.
Yeah, I think BDS is a good example because it's basically a call from Palestinian civil society to the international community to boycott, to push for the divestment and sanctions. So yeah, I think basically just listening to the demands of the people in the global south and organizing movements around that actually lead to material change. And also, I guess, like, I know it's like a long-term solution, but like basically political education, especially surrounding white saviorism that people in the West have, and the ideas of like global development and like the idea of developing countries, and especially like when you think of like NGOs and the United Nations, these are basically just like neo-colonial organizations. And at university, you meet a lot of people who are aspiring to work in these organizations, like law students, politics students. These people are basically like, to them, liberation is working in the United Nations or working in an NGO. So, and what these organizations do, it's basically makes these countries dependent on like foreign funding, and it basically forces them into the global system. So yeah, so I think because even though these are systems, they're enforced as well by people. So I know it's like a long-term solution, but I think education is really important, especially around white saviorism and the logic of like developed countries versus developing countries.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Fraser said about like the fact that obviously like we haven't abolished capitalism, and we don't think we will abolish capitalism in the foreseeable future, but we have to act like we're on the way to doing that anyway. And we have to like create these spaces and those echo chambers where we bounce ideas off each other, and that are explicitly safe spaces for people of color, from people who want to transform the world, because that is where like change will start. Like that is the seed. And also like we can't just constantly like criticize the structures that exist without thinking of like what is going to replace them when they're gone. And that work has to start now. So if we say we want to abolish police and we want to abolish prisons, we need to already be thinking about transformative justice, and we already need to be practicing it. And that the same goes for like climate change. And my favorite quote, like that I always find so much hope and inspiration in when I'm thinking of like change, and if I get a bit of like eco anxiety or anxiety about like capitalism or whatever, you just act like you're already there, basically. Like you're living the utopia, like in those small spaces that you're given, and you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. That's Angela Davis. So I think that always gives me a lot of hope and inspiration.
Thank you so much, Aspa. And yeah, just thank you to all of you. I love listening to all of you speak. Yeah, it's honestly just such a pleasure to be here to listen to you guys speak. So yeah, I think, yeah, we have 2 minutes left. So yeah, just thank you all for coming. One thing I did want to do was quickly ask each of you for like a favorite book, documentary that you would recommend audience members or me as well to go away and read or watch. Yeah. So yeah, you can put your hands up. It doesn't need to be like Fraser.
I'm reading this book at the moment called Resource Radicals by Theoria Frankos, which is it's quite interesting. It kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of some of these questions as they play out in Ecuador in the pink tide, and the tensions that emerge between different sections of the Ecuadorian working class, indigenous peoples movements who are kind of pushing a kind of against extractivism more, but then the limits to that with kind of urban working classes kind of supporting the investment of those revenues in social programs. And it's just really interesting at like getting into the details of the limits to, yeah.
Thank you, Fraser. Hidil?
Yeah, I'm a literature student, so I'm gonna give you fiction. I'm doing my dissertation on a Palestinian author. Her name is Sahar Khalifa. So I'd recommend two of her novels. The first one is Wild Thorns, and basically, it's about people living in the West Bank post 1967. So the occupation has already started, and the idea of having to address people's like material needs rather than romanticize the revolution. And also another one of her novels of noble origins. It's a historical fiction set like pre-1948, like during the British Mandate, and I really like that novel because you kind of you see like the urban versus rural divide, and you basically see like people's connection to the land, and you see how basically like Zionism actually preceded 1948 as well. So yeah, I just feel like these books, even though they're fiction, there's a lot of like political ideas to like take from them as well. I'll put them in the chat.
Thank you so much. That sounds so interesting. Yeah, so like me and Asosa will create like a kind of reading list by the end of Green Week, and possibly like publicize it so you can all see it then. Asma, then Tommy.
Yeah, I want to recommend this book. It's called Breeding Sweetgrass. I read it over the summer, and it's written by this Native American indigenous botanist, and I think it's relevant because we talked a lot about like how science and the language of science in itself can actually contribute to the problem. So basically, it's called Breeding Sweetgrass because there's 3 strands in a braid, and she braids indigenous wisdom with scientific knowledge and the teaching of plants, and see how they can all complement each other, and actually give so many examples of resilient communities and ways of practicing and ways of like living in harmony with the earth and the plants. And I think it's really beautiful and hopeful, and not as anxiety-inducing as some of the other reads that you can have about climate change.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Tommy.
Yeah, mine's not specifically about climate change, but I'm doing Border Imperialism by Harsha Walia. It's a really good book, which basically so she's like an activist scholar who works in America with undocumented migrants, and yeah, it talks about like how exactly the concept of border imperialism as a way of understanding sort of capitalist imperialism and how it works on how it actually sort of regulated by states on a global level. And I think in the context of the climate crisis, understanding how exactly borders do function as an extension of colonialism and imperial power relations, I think is very important to like resisting some of the biggest effects of climate change going forward, because there's going to be a lot of climate refugees even within like 30 years. And as we said about understanding climate change as interconnected, this, I think the movement of people away from places which have been destroyed by climate change is maybe, I think it will crystallize almost all the different struggles involved in it. So I think, yeah, it's important going forward to understand borders and do what we can to combat them.
Thank you. Rachel, then Hidil.
I would say Walter Rodney is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I think that book really, I think for me, it was a very good like introduction in how all of these, well, I mean, I kind of knew, but in terms of like explaining it, how all of these structures, so capitalism, racism, borders, all of these concepts contribute to the current state of Africa today. And I would recommend that book. I feel like it really does. It's a good like introduction, and it also explains things quite well.
Oh yeah, Hidil.
Yeah, just one more thing to add. Not really a reading recommendation, but more like approach towards reading. I feel like it's important to not only center like Black and brown voices, but also to center those voices in translation, like to read the works of these people who have actually grown up in these areas, because like even if I want to read like Palestinian authors who have written and are like living in the UK or the US, like, you know, like diaspora fiction or whatever, it's still going to be very different than like the actual lived experiences of the people in these areas. So I feel like a lot of effort also has to be done to like read works in translation, because there's like sometimes it's a whole different world than what's written in English as well.
Thank you so much, Hidil. And yeah, also just to say, we'll also be having a reading club this Sunday on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. So yeah, but yeah, thank you all so much for coming. And yeah, I hope you all have an amazing day. Thank you. So, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to say that we have 2 events tomorrow. The first one is
Feminist activism.
Feminist activism. Oh, we have 3 events then. Feminist activism on campus for International Women's Week with Amara, Women's Officer. Then we've got climate crisis, a feminist issue, and then we've also got a sustainable periods pad making event tomorrow as well. But all that information will be on our socials. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for coming, and thank you to all of our brilliant panelists for all of the knowledge that you've shared. I feel like I've learned so much just like sitting here. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for organising.
Yeah, thanks for organising. I really enjoyed it.
Bye, everyone.
Should we stop the recording?
Yeah, I'll stop it now.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.